The Canada 2020 conference brought together some of the most influential thinkers and political actors on a bunch of issues, and all through the conference we brought those participants up to this couch to interview them. My colleague John Geddes and I had a series of interviews, and here are highlights from those conversations. I'm here with Don Iveson, who is the new-ish mayor of Edmonton. And
almost a year.
Almost a year. We just had a panel at the Canada 2020 conference on infrastructure, and you had some interesting stories to tell, as almost any big city mayor would, about the challenges that you have dealing with infrastructure. What are some of those challenges?
Well, first of all, Alberta's Canada's fastest growing province. Edmonton is Alberta's fastest growing city, and therefore also the Canada's fastest, or the nation's fastest growing city. And so we've got growth pressures, 3.5% growth in population, and that's about the most that an industrialized economy can manage before things just go sideways. So we're having trouble building schools, hospitals to keep up. We can manage roads and drainage and the basics, but it's tough. There are constraints. And at the same time as the city is growing, it needs to adapt. And so we've got this urban shift that we're doing. You know, as many sprawling North American cities struggle to now build up to revitalize older areas, we're working to do that. Key feature of that is transit, which we've been investing in. We were actually the first North American city to build light rail. Back in the late 60s, we started the work and built it, opened it in the 70s for Commonwealth Games in 1978, and we've added to it incrementally since then. And we've got provincial and federal investment lined up to build another 13 kilometers of it the next few years. But out beyond that, I have no certainty, and I've got another many billions of dollars worth of light rail that I need to connect people to jobs and to school and to entertainment and to keep activity vibrant in our downtown, to decongest our roads, to clean our air, to help people deal with the rising cost of housing by lowering their cost of transportation. Like every other mayor of a major Canadian city right now, I've got a multi-billion-dollar transit plan. We hear a lot about Toronto's, which is essential. Having lived there and having traveled there, it's essential. But it's equally essential in Ottawa to get phase 2 of the light rail, a line of sight to that. Equally important in Edmonton and Calgary, equally important for the Broadway subway line and for Gregor in Vancouver. And so we get together as big city mayors and we sort of compare our lists, and the needs vastly outstrip the resources that are available, not just federally, but also provincially and certainly within our own municipalities with the limited resources we have, growth pressures we have, aging infrastructure we've inherited, and so on and so forth. So the scale is broad, but there's a coalition of people working on it, and more discussion about the upsides of making these investments in transformative infrastructure that'll keep Canada competitive.
Hey, I'm Nick Taylor-Vasey here with Macleans.ca at Canada 2020 at the Ottawa Convention Centre. We put some of the conference's leading thinkers on the spot between the second level of the Convention Centre and the third level on this escalator ride. We forced them to give us their vision for Canada in 2020. Some of them took all 30 seconds, some of them took less time. Check out for yourself some of the clips.
I think Canada really wants to take itself off the trajectory it's on right now, which is pretty grim and bleak, at least in public outlook, and restore the really kind of triumphal, happy, cosmopolitan outlook that dominated at the end of the last century. I think all the ingredients are there, but the public believe that we need a clear blueprint to restart both economic progress and democratic legitimacy. It's not going to happen spontaneously. So I think Canadians are very optimistic, but not necessarily confident that they will be there. I think they will, I hope they will, and that's what I'd have to say.
Frank, you talked a bit about issues involving people's attitudes towards the economy, and specifically whether or not they view themselves as in the middle class, or whether they view themselves as rising members of the middle class, or maybe stagnant or falling members. At Maclean's, we've been very interested in this subject, and our writers and some of the economists who write for our website have waded in a lot on the question of what is the real state of the middle class? Are Canadians getting poorer? Are they getting richer? But you were suggesting that in a way, at least in understanding Canadian politics, those questions about the real state of the middle class matter less than the real attitude of people about their position, their security, whether they're rising or falling. Can you talk to that?
Well, there is that kind of realpolitik idea that it doesn't matter what the numbers show. The official statistics may show this or that, but if the public feel this in their heart of hearts, then it really is the economy's.
What do they feel in their heart of hearts?
Well, I mean, the numbers couldn't be clearer. And by the way, the official stats, when you parse them properly, show that the public aren't being foolish. There is stuff going on. And I would take serious issue with some of the more economistic treatments of the numbers that say, oh yes, the middle class are doing swimmingly well. Well, listen, we had Upper North America and Canada and the United States are pretty well the same on this, experienced growth rates in the last 40 years of the 20th century of between 4 and 5%. And that cumulatively spilled over each year into a better and better economy with more and more money to go around. What happened since, and ironically, it's basically after September 11th we see these problems start to occur, we entered an age of stagnation. The growth rates of 4 and 5% have been replaced with growth rates between 1 and 2%, if you count in the interruptions of the 2008 recession. Not only that, there's been a dramatic shift in the incidence of how that more tepid growth is distributed, with a much greater fraction going to a much smaller group at the top. So basically, you can say, oh, the middle class is doing really well, but it's hard to, this must defy the laws of economic gravity. Because if you have things growing at 5% that now grow at 2% and is being distributed more unequally, how can that possibly be the fuel of a better middle class?
Okay, so accepting that that's the reality, how is that translating into people's attitudes, and
Well,
how important is that in people framing their own sense of where they fit in that
Well,
society?
I think the public believe it's a defining issue. I mean, in simplest terms, the public feel, with a matter of conviction and consensus, that having a optimistic and growing middle class that's moving forward is an essential precondition for a healthy economy and a healthy society. By equally strong consensus, nobody thinks that's happening anymore. And I would argue the numbers suggest that when you look at how this is unraveling as you move from seniors who did do quite well to boomers where things are more mixed, to the Gen X and below where, no, it's not working nearly as well. They're not doing better than their parents.
You had an interesting statistic. Can you tell me, I don't know if you can rhyme it off here, having to do with people's view about whether their children or grandchildren will do better than them.
Yeah, well, there are two statistics I think are really disturbing, because this gray outlook on the future where people say, gee, I'm not sure that we're moving ahead like we used to. We always used to do better. If you work hard, you come up with a better mousetrap, then you're gonna have the few luxuries. You get a car, you get a house, you do better than your dad or mom, and your kids will do better, and you'll be secure in your retirement. People no longer feel that's on. And you know what, some of the evidence suggests they're right. But when you ask people to think about, well, how does this look down the road? Let's go 25 years down the road, which is about a generational lens. 13% of Canadians think the next generation is going to be doing better than this one.
13%.
Yeah, it's 9% in the United States, which makes it a little worse, but that's a horrible statistic.
Yes.
And when we look at the numbers that say, okay, so how are you doing compared to your dad? In this case, it's a fair technical comparison, because if your women worked in the past, and you're making more or less money today than your dad did it when he was your age. And for seniors, absolutely. Everybody says, I'm doing much better. Only 15% say they're doing worse. But when we go to the boomers, that number rises to 30. We go to the Gen X and below 45, the number rises up to almost 50. So what you see in a very short period of time is this period where people did do better through hard work and effort is being replaced by an era not only of stagnation, there's a threefold rise in the rate of intergenerational downward mobility. And the hard evidence, when it starts coming in, it takes longer to assemble that than asking people in social surveys, is confirming that these trends really are happening. So the people that say this is some kind of an exaggerated illusion, they're just ignoring what the public are experiencing.
Where I want Canada to be in 2020 is a country with a national vision, where we have a government that is a federal government that's working with provinces to make real an infrastructure strategy across the country, to make real a Canada pension plan, to make real a child care policy across the country. I think that we have such potential. Our economy can grow, but we need everybody working together, not out of ideology, but out of a practical sense of solving problems.
I see a Canada in 2020 in which children feel secure, have the opportunity to become everything they can be. In part, that means much lower levels of child poverty, and it means for everybody feeling much more secure in raising their children and having the time to do it.
Miles Korak of University of Ottawa, you were at a panel at Canada 2020 here this morning where income inequality was on the table, and you're one of the great world experts on that. People in a crowd like this will be thinking both about what is the state of income inequality, but also what kind of policy tools do they have at their disposal to work with it. Sometimes I know people who are frustrated with this discussion say, well, it's just an excuse for talking about taxing and spending, redistributing income. You have a more nuanced view than that. Where do you think the debate should come when we're coming from seeing a problem to thinking about policy to address it?
Well, we should be very clear that inequality has increased in Canada unambiguously, but there's also regional divide to that. But it's not just a tax and spend or tax and transfer set of solutions. Inequality is an outcome we have to worry about, but we should also be worried about the underlying process that generates inequality. And that process is very different now than it was a generation or so ago. The labor market is much more turbulent, it's much more polarized. And that means two things. It means, on the one hand, greater opportunities, but also greater risks. So when we think about policies, we should sort of think about risks and managing
risk to individuals.
To individuals. Well, take, for example, the decision to get a university education. And everyone tells us that having a higher degree is very important.
It's the most common response you hear in this debate.
It's a gateway to success. But which degree, in which field, and in which university? Those are very hard choices to make, and we can't expect 17 or 18-year-olds to get them right at this point in their life. And some of them will be lucky in their choices and some not so. So we might sort of think about giving people a little bit more flexibility if their education decisions don't turn out that well. If they have any debt as a result of that, we should think about a much more fluid and automatic system of forgiving that debt so that they can start again.
So I made a bad bet. I got a degree that I hoped would get me a good job right away. It didn't. I'm having trouble paying my student loan back. Is that, you're saying that should be, I should know, well, I'm going to get help with that, or it's going to be forgiven, something like that?
That's right. And in fact, currently we do have a system. It's called the Repayment Assistance Plan. But the students really don't know that much about it. And in fact, I think one of the great policies that the Canadian Student Association has put forward is sort of an automatic wrap, is what they call. So that through your income tax system, we know whether your income is falling off tremendously and you're having debt problems. So your repayment schedule is automatically geared to what your income is.
It sounds like, sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like a kind of policy that might straddle some typical ideological divides in the sense that it doesn't remove the incentive for people to try to pursue opportunity, but it alleviates some of the bad outcomes if that doesn't work out the way you're hoping.
Right, but also at the other end, it could have other influences. A lot of people are dissuaded from going into some fields. For example, the professions, law, medicine, business, are very expensive. The tuition fees are horrendous. And a lot of people have that kind of sticker shock and they're not going to go into that field. But if they have a sense of more security and insurance to know that if things don't work out, there'll be a floor underneath them, that's really important. And it keeps people engaged in their own lives and in the labor market.
So the Canadian Cancer Society sees two things: saving lives and caring for Canadians. So preventing cancer, healthy lifestyles, reduction of tobacco, and making sure that those who have cancer are cared for. So caregivers, better support, financial burden, and of course research.
Canada is going to be even more urban in 2020, but the success of those cities is still in doubt today. But what I hope happens over the next 6 years is that we get a long-term infrastructure strategy that invests in people, invests in resiliency and in adaptation to climate change that we're seeing, and most importantly invests in the mobility of people, especially in our large cities with nation-building transit projects from coast to coast.
Jean Charest, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
Every time you show your face in Ottawa on Talk Politics, someone says he wants Stephen Harper's job. Let's just start by getting you on the record on that. Do you want back into politics?
The answer is no. And I got into trouble. You and I talked about this earlier this summer because, you know, the answer you give, the honest answer is you never say never because who knows where life will lead you. But I'm very happy with what I'm doing. I'm with the law firm of McCarthy Tétrault. I travel a lot, I participate in public debates, but I have no yearning to return in politics and no plans certainly to do that, and I don't ever see myself returning.
Okay. Now here at the Canada 2020 conference, among your duties today was to take part in a panel on energy and the environment. I was struck by your remarks about bringing in Aboriginal populations. You say essentially it can't be done if you don't. You have to start from the beginning. I've heard similar things from Christy Clark in British Columbia, from Jim Prentice, the new Premier of Alberta. The federal government seems to have been slow to get that message.
Well, on the issue of climate change in general and on some projects, I think the federal government has been more reticent about getting involved and being activists on that. And frankly, at the end of the day, a number of projects are not going to happen if the First Nations are not part of it, period. So let's, recognize that and act accordingly. And the other experience I have, Paul, on projects is the more you work upstream on any given project, the more chances you have of succeeding. And as opposed to just coming in front of someone and saying, well, here's a mine project, here's a pipeline project, are you for or against it, or what are your conditions? You may end up doing it, but it's going to be a lot more work as opposed to working upstream. So if we learn those lessons well, it will allow us to have better projects and to better serve the environment, by the way, to have better decisions on how we execute.
Okay. One, I guess, probably last subject I want to touch on is university tuition fees.
Yeah.
It preoccupied you during your last year in office. There were demonstrations, often violent demonstrations across the province. And the next Liberal government to get elected, the current Liberal government, has essentially adopted PQ policy on tuition fees. Do you feel like you put in a lot of effort for not a lot of result?
Well, I didn't get the result I wanted, and I fought an election over it, and I was happy to have fought the election over it because I believed in it, and I thought it was important for us to go all the way and to force that issue into a campaign where people would vote. Now we lost that campaign by 0.7% or something, so it was very, very close. Now, and Quebec is going to be in a tough situation now because the universities are underfunded, and there's not a lot of places to go. The government already funds universities on a per capita basis more in Quebec than anywhere else because of low tuition fees. And if they want more funding, frankly, that's where they have to go. And the policy we had was fair. It was very reasonable, but it got caught up in a bigger play to try to hurt the government. I don't disagree with Couillard. If I were them, honestly, I'm not sure I'd reopen the file because of the past history.
It's too early to fight that again?
I think it's too early, and I went through it, the campaign, the PQ, and afterwards. He has, and that government has, a lot of issues to deal with in terms of containing spending, making choices. And I think they're right to focus on a number of issues, and who knows, eventually they may get to that matter, and maybe they'll do it in a better environment, and hopefully they'll do it better than I did with a better outcome.
It's now time for the Maclean's panel. I'm Cormac McSweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for City News and Rogers Radio, and I'm joined this week by Maclean's political editor Paul Wells and Maclean's Ottawa Bureau Chief John Geddes. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks.
And of course, this is a special edition of the Maclean's panel because we're here on the floor of the Canada 2020 conference, but we're not really going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Iraq, specifically the Prime Minister's pitch to the House of Commons today. John, we'll start off with you. You were in the House of Commons watching that from the press gallery. Do you think that the Prime Minister made an effective pitch to the nation for why we should start in a combat role and send our fighter jets over to Iraq and possibly Syria?
I think in balance it was pretty effective. But almost before thinking about the content, you have to think about the timing. This has taken a long time for him to get around to it. It was some days ago that he floated this idea of a combat role in an interview with the Wall Street Journal in New York. It's been days since the Brits did a much more responsible seeming parliamentary process to build a bipartisan consensus in their House of Commons and this kind of thing. So the Prime Minister has taken a lot of time to get to this point. Now, that said, his speech today was quite effective, and I thought he sketched the parameters, laid out very clearly. He didn't mean for this to become a combat mission with boots on the ground, combat mission that's an airstrikes mission. Some of the main points, he sold them quite effectively. Whether he's ragged the puck too long to get to this point is though a serious question.
Paul, did the lack of urgency play into this at all, or will it in the end, in the eyes of the public?
I don't think it will in the end. I was struck by the modesty of the Prime Minister's project. This is an extraordinarily circumscribed thing. He's getting a 6-month mandate. If he wants the mission to extend beyond that, he's going to have to re-ask. 6 fighters. That's a 1/3 smaller deployment than France is offering, and specifically ruling out any ground involvement by Canadian troops. I mean, we're looking at probably something close to 1/20th the size of the deployment that John Chrétien sent to Afghanistan in 2002 or 3, and so Harper wants to ask for so little that if the opposition parties say no, they come off as essentially quite chintzy.
So, John, is the opposition stuck in a tough spot here with this one? Because on one hand, they're saying these terrorists who are beheading people and raping women and doing all sorts of atrocities, they need to be stopped. But they don't want to take part in the actual action that will physically stop these people from doing these crimes. So are they stuck in a really tough spot here?
I think they are, and here's how they've gotten themselves stuck. They've allowed two quite separate questions to get blurred together. One is the question of, what is the mission that Canada is being asked to carry out, and what's the context for it? It's a limited mission, as Paul says, in the context of an international coalition pulled together by Barack Obama, still a very popular president in Canada. So that's the mission. They've allowed that to get messed together with something else, which is the way the Prime Minister plays parliamentary politics. The fact that he hasn't really respected Parliament up to this point in this thing, that he hasn't done the normal stuff of briefing the opposition leaders or their defense critics on what's going to happen. You could go down a checklist of things he could have done to make this seem like a more methodical, more respectful process. Instead of isolating that aspect of the Prime Minister's way of operating, which I think either Thomas Mulcair or Justin Trudeau could have done, they've made that case but allowed it to blur almost sentence by sentence into a kind of, I would say, not very convincing denunciation of the mission itself. And I think that's where they've got themselves into trouble.
Paul, is it fair for the opposition parties to be comparing this to the former war in Iraq? Because that was in both opposition leaders' speeches today, from Justin Trudeau and from Thomas Mulcair. They seem to be trying to link these two things. Obviously, the former one was a much worse war at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to make the comparison, but it invites the comparison. And what strikes you is the differences at least as much as the similarities. This is not an attempt to change the regime in Iraq. It's actually an attempt to prop up the regime in Iraq. It is not a sort of classic industrial war with hundreds of thousands of troops involved. It's very small, so small that you can ask whether Western involvement would make any real concrete difference. You know,
valid question.
And so when people say this is just like George Bush's war in Iraq, my answer is no, it's not. It has its own problems. It's hastily improvised against an enemy that is far more diffuse and far more poorly understood. You know, but this isn't George Bush's war. It's Barack Obama's thing.
There's an old saying that, you know, generals always want to fight the last war. This seems to be the case of politicians not wanting to fight again the last war they didn't fight. You know, it really doesn't work.
And I found it very interesting that we saw the Liberals sort of take on the exact same line that the NDP had been pushing for weeks now. And now all of a sudden it seems like Justin Trudeau, just before the Prime Minister's announcement, has been the face of the opposition narrative on this one, simply by taking on the other opposition party's narrative in the first place.
But Trudeau is to some extent the only interesting player in this. He's the valence electron. If there was a fight against Islamic fundamentalism at low cost, you knew that Stephen Harper was going to be involved. And you were pretty sure that if Stephen Harper wanted to send the military somewhere, Thomas Mulcair would say no. So the interesting question is, which side is Trudeau on? And I admit to being surprised that he's on the let's not do it side. But I keep remembering this week, Jean Chrétien during the first Gulf War. Most of his critiques of that limited airstrike-based intervention by Brian Mulroney didn't make a lot of sense. Send the ships and then bring them back. Have the guys in the air on Tuesdays but not on Thursdays. But after it was done, Chrétien won a large majority government in the next election and buried the Progressive Conservative Party. Maybe that's the precedent that Justin Trudeau had in mind this week.
John?
Just to pick up on what Paul was saying there, though, an interesting way to think about this, and I almost hate to take such a serious international policy decision and boil it down to an electoral politics calculation, but what the heck. One way to think about the problem for the Liberals and the NDP in the last few elections was vote splitting on the left, right? This is a common argument about how Prime Minister Stephen Harper stayed in power. The beauty of the Justin Trudeau experiment to date was his reassertion of the idea that, hey, maybe you can straddle the center in Canadian politics. Maybe it doesn't have to be a polar thing where you're either splitting the vote on the right or splitting the vote on the left. Maybe you can be a center straddling party. The problem with this particular moment for him is that, perhaps out of conviction, I'm not sure why, he's allowed us to revert back to a moment where we're talking about just two parts of the spectrum. There's no center here. There's a left of center position and a right of center position. Not the most advantageous place if you're a Liberal who's trying to be the middle.
And then he's blurring the lines between Liberals and NDP now by taking on a few
or
of the NDP
Or is he
narratives.
simply like, lumping himself in with the NDP again, at least on this one issue? Let's not overstate the point here. The Canadian elections are not won or lost generally on foreign policy. And the point here is that we're a year out, but on the increments, on the edges, this has to be a point where Conservatives are saying, hey, we've had a bad run for a long time here, and now we're looking at a way of repositioning the Prime Minister that may be advantageous.
And then finally, just the exit strategy for the Prime Minister. The opposition parties are saying if we hit that 6-month mark, we could extend it even further and then further, and they're saying it could end up like Afghanistan, where we go 11 years on this mission. Do you see the Iraq mission as it stands right now similar in that sense of we could see this go on for years?
We could, but in really small increments, and at political risk to the Prime Minister every time he re-asks. Let's assume that 6-month window is the window that he uses if he renews. I mean, that's a quarter the length of the extensions of the Afghanistan mandate. Those were 2-year extensions. And so 4 times as often, he's got to go before the House of Commons and relive this psychodrama. I think that reflects Harper's low level of comfort with what Barack Obama and this cobbled together coalition are doing. I don't think Stephen Harper is entirely comfortable with what he's getting into. And so I think he's built his own caution into this process.
John, do you think it'll be a multi-year mission?
Cormac, I'd be lying if I pretended I had any kind of insight into how long this will go on. I'll say this, though. I agree with people who say that the Sunni Shiite struggle in the Middle East is very fundamental, deep-rooted, and somehow it's going to keep playing out for a long time to come. So to the degree that Western powers have to introduce themselves into that struggle, I guess we're always going to be at risk of, we're a NATO country, we're always going to be at risk of being pulled into it.
All right, that's the Maclean's panel at the Canada 2020 conference. I'm Parliament Hill reporter for City News and Rogers Radio, Cormac McSweeney, joined by Maclean's political editor Paul Wells and Maclean's Ottawa Bureau Chief John Geddes. Thanks very much, guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you.